For 31 years, Edith Calloway had slept with the bedroom window latched and the curtains pulled tight because she did not want to see the tree line. She had gotten very good at not seeing it. And then, on a Tuesday night in the third week of November, something sat down at the edge of her yard and refused to let her pretend anymore. She heard it first. A sound that was not quite a sound, more like a pressure in the air, the way the house held its breath before a storm. She was in the kitchen, rinsing a single mug, the radio playing soft enough that she could convince herself she was not the only person in the world at that hour. The program was one of those overnight nature shows, someone describing the migration patterns of birds that travel at night, and she had the volume low enough that it was more texture than information, more company than content. She turned the radio off. The pressure did not go away. It settled deeper, like something breathing just beyond the walls, patient and enormous, and pointed directly at her. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was a deer, or wind moving through the high branches, or the particular loneliness of November, doing what November always did to a woman who lived alone on 12 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills. She dried the mug. She set it on the shelf with the 3 other mugs she used, the ones with worn handles she had never replaced, and she stood there with her back to the window and her hands on the counter, and she told herself several more things in quick succession, each one slightly less convincing than the last. She turned the radio back on. She went to bed at 9 o'clock like she always did, like she had for 31 years, and lay there listening to the silence on the other side of the curtain with her hands folded on top of the quilt, not moving, not sleeping, waiting for whatever was out there to leave. It did not leave. She could hear it breathing. That was the part she could not explain to people afterward, could not make them understand, because they always asked how she could possibly hear an animal breathing through a closed window, through 4 inches of old pine wall, through 3 decades of practice at not hearing things. But she could. It was not the breathing itself she heard, she would tell them. It was the weight of it, the certainty of something alive and present, something patient, something that had chosen her yard specifically, her house specifically, this particular window specifically, and had no intention of being discouraged. It was the way a room feels different when you have woken up in the night, and you know, before you open your eyes or make a sound, that you are not alone in it. She had not felt that feeling in a very long time, and feeling it now, through the wall, through the curtain, aimed at her from 30 feet away in the cold November dark, did something to her chest that she was not prepared for. She lay there until 2 in the morning. Then she got up, wrapped herself in the old wool cardigan she kept on the bedpost, the one she had started keeping there after the 3rd winter alone, when she understood that she was going to keep being alone for a while, and she crossed the floor in the dark without turning on the light, because turning on the light would make this more real, and she pulled back the curtain 2 inches. The wolf was sitting at the edge of the yard, where the grass met the dead leaves of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from her window, and it was looking directly at her, not in the direction of the window, directly at her, as if it had known exactly where she would appear, exactly when she would appear, and had been waiting with the specific patience of something that does not experience time the way people do. Its coat was gray and thick and pale in the moonlight, layered the way winter coats are layered, deep at the chest and shoulders and lighter at the legs, and the overall effect in the dark was of something that had been assembled from the landscape itself, from the pale dead grass and the gray bark of the trees and the particular quality of light on a clear November night. It was very large, larger than the deer that came through in autumn or the coyotes she heard sometimes but never saw. It was sitting with its front legs straight and its tail wrapped around its body and its yellow eyes fixed on her face through the glass. She dropped the curtain. She stood with her back against the wall, with her heart going very fast, and told herself that this was nothing, that wolves had been returning to parts of Virginia for years, that she had read about it, that it was a natural event and not a personal one. She told herself that a wolf sitting at the edge of her yard was not the same as a wolf sitting there for her, that the distinction mattered. That one was biology, and the other was the kind of thinking that happened when a 74-year-old woman who lived alone started spending too much time in her own head. She told herself these things carefully and deliberately, and when she was done telling them, she was still standing with her back against the wall, and the pressure on the other side of it had not changed at all. But in the morning, when she checked, the tracks were still in the soft earth at the tree line. Four-toed and enormous, larger than her spread hand, pressed clearly into the dirt where something heavy had sat for a long time. And the following night, when she finally worked up the nerve to pull the curtain back at midnight, the wolf was there again. Same place, same posture, same direction, looking at the window like it had been there all along and had never expected to be anywhere else. That should have been the end of it. She should have called animal control, or Prentice Paul at the ranger station, or her daughter Clem in Charlotte, who called every Sunday and would have had opinions, probably good ones, Clem having spent 30 years being sensible on Edith's behalf. She should have done any of those reasonable things, any one of them, and gone to bed reassured by the knowledge that she had handed the problem to someone else who was better equipped to hold it. She did not. Not that night, and not for the 14 nights that followed. What she did instead was start watching. She began keeping a notebook on the bedside table. A small one, the kind she used for grocery lists and the occasional letter she wrote to the cousins she rarely called but occasionally wrote. She started recording arrival times and weather and the temperature on the outdoor thermometer she could read from the kitchen window, and anything she noticed about the wolf's behavior that seemed worth noting. She had been a school librarian for 26 years, which had given her certain instincts about organizing information, about not trusting memory with things that needed to be exact, and she applied those instincts now with the same quiet efficiency she had applied to everything else she had needed to survive. The wolf arrived between 11 and midnight most nights. It sat. It was always alone. It did not approach the house and did not make sounds, at least not in the early part of the night. Once, around 1 in the morning on the 5th night, it yawned, a long, slow yawn that she saw through the curtain gap as a widening of shadow in its face. And the naturalness of that gesture did something unexpected to her fear. She had been afraid of something enormous and incomprehensible, and then for a moment she was afraid of something that got tired and yawned in the cold. And those two fears were not the same fear at all. On the 7th night, she moved a kitchen chair to the bedroom and set it facing the window, and she sat in it with the curtain parted 2 inches and a cup of chamomile tea, and she watched the wolf, the way she had once watched her students read, with a quality of attention that was not intrusive, but was not absent either. The attention of someone cataloging something they do not yet fully understand. Up close, from the specific vantage of the chair, she could see things the curtain gap had not allowed. The wolf was a male, she thought, though she did not claim expertise in these distinctions. Its face had a quality she did not have a better word for than serious, a quality of sustained internal processing, as if whatever it was doing at the edge of her yard required something of it beyond mere presence. It sat the way animals sit when they are in a place they have chosen rather than arrived at, deliberately, with weight. On the 8th night, she noticed for the first time that it never looked away from the house. For the entire 2+ hours it sat there, it never turned to look at a sound in the forest, never tracked the movement of the few nocturnal things that moved in those hours, never did this scanning behavior she associated with animals that were listening for danger. It simply sat and looked at the window. She told herself it was looking at the light. She had started leaving the small lamp on in the hallway, visible as a thin line under the bedroom door, because sitting in the complete dark had begun to feel like too much of a statement. She told herself the wolf was attracted to the light, She told herself several versions of this explanation and discarded all of them because none of them accounted for the bearing. Edith Calloway was 74 years old and had lived in the house on Ventry Ridge Road since she was 43, which meant she had lived there for 31 years, which meant she had moved in the same autumn that Gail Calloway walked into the Harmon County forest and did not come back. Those two facts were not unrelated. The house was the thing she had bought with the insurance, money, and the settlement from the forestry company, and the careful, humiliated savings of a woman who had to rebuild a life from a standing start. And she had chosen it precisely because it was remote, because it was private, because no one who lived there would be expected to explain themselves to anyone, and because the 12 acres and the old pine walls and the long view across the fields would give her somewhere to put the noise, inside her where it could not bother anyone. She had not been left, as it turned out, but she had not known that for 31 years, and 31 years is long enough that the thing you believed becomes the thing that shapes you, the thing you build your days around, the thing you are still, quietly, carrying when a wolf sits down in your yard and looks at you through a window at 2 a.m. She had met Gail when she was 34. He was 37, a forestry consultant who had grown up in the mountains and never quite made peace with towns, and she had been immediately and completely drawn to that quality in him, the quality of a person whose relationship to the world was spatial and physical in a way hers was not, who measured distance in ridgelines and weather, in barometric shifts and beauty, in the specific way light behaved at different elevations. She was a person who measured things in text, in the orderly accumulation of words, in the way a well-organized reference section could be a kind of comfort in itself. And she had spent 34 years finding the world slightly too abstract, slightly too much composed of interpretations, and not enough of things. And when she met Gail, she felt for the first time like she was standing next to someone who lived in the same world she could see, but had not been able to put her hands on. They married in the spring. They lived for 9 years in Roanoke, in a house with a vegetable garden and a workshop in the back where Gail made furniture on the weekends. Good furniture, careful and considered the way he was careful and considered. And those 9 years had a texture she could still feel, and she was quiet enough to let herself feel things. Not perfect. No 9 years with another person are perfect, but specific, saturated with the specific quality of being known by someone and knowing them back. The small language of habit and preference, and the particular humor that develops between two people who have decided to pay attention to each other across a span of years. Gail had disappeared on the 4th of October. She had reported him missing on the 7th, after waiting 3 days, because he had told her he was taking a solo work trip into the Upper Ridge, and that she should not worry if he was gone longer than expected, that he had supplies for a week, that the cell service up there was not reliable. She had waited 3 days and then called the sheriff's office because she was not the kind of woman who panicked prematurely, and the sheriff's office had mounted a search the following day with a team of 8, including 2 people with tracking dogs and a volunteer group from the county search and rescue organization. They searched for 5 days and found nothing. No camp, no gear, no trace of passage beyond the first mile of the trail. The forestry road he had taken showed his truck parked at the trailhead, and the trail showed boot prints going in, and then nothing. The prints simply stopped, as if Gail Calloway had taken a step into a place that did not have a floor and ceased to exist. The investigation had lasted 11 weeks. The conclusion was inconclusive. He had either gotten lost and died of exposure, which happened with experienced people more often than anyone wanted to admit, or he had intended to disappear, which also happened, and which the investigators treated as the more likely explanation the longer the search went on without a body. There was no evidence of accident. There was no evidence of foul play. There was only the absence of a man, clean and complete, in a part of the forest that even experienced hikers treated with respect. During those 11 weeks, Edith had existed in a state she would later describe as suspended. As if time had become a medium she was moving through rather than a dimension she was living in. She had gone to work every day because the library had needed her and because doing her job had felt like the only proof available to her that she still existed and that existence still had requirements. She had answered the investigators' questions carefully and thoroughly and had told them nearly everything she knew. Nearly everything. There had been things she had not told them. A conversation in August that she had replayed so many times, the words had worn grooves in some part of her she could not locate. She and Gail at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, the coffee going cold, the conversation starting as one kind of conversation and turning into another kind while she was still expecting the first kind. He had been distracted for months. She had told herself it was work stress. And that Sunday morning she had asked him directly, and he had said something that she had heard one way and had spent 31 years hearing again in a different way. He had said, "Things are harder than I've been letting on. I've been trying to keep it from you." And she had asked what things, and he had said the money and some of this work, and I've been afraid. And she had said afraid of what? And he had said of losing what we have. She had heard that as a confession of financial trouble and suppressed anxiety. She had told the investigators about it in those terms. A man under work-related stress, concerned about money, the way she had understood it at the time. What she had not told them was what she had started to hear in that sentence afterward. The way afraid of losing what we have had started to sound less like anxiety about the future and more like the speech of a man already planning his exit, already standing on the edge of something and beginning to grieve it in advance. She had also not told them about the papers she had found in his truck the previous winter, a sheaf of documents she had picked up without thinking while looking for the registration, papers with columns of numbers and a company name she did not recognize and handwriting in the margins. That was not Gail's. She had put them back where she found them. She had not asked about them. She had not asked because asking would have required her to think about what they might mean. And she had not wanted to think about that because she had been happy, and happiness is fragile, and you learn, after a certain age, to carry it carefully and not examine it too closely. She had, in the second week of the search, gone back to the truck, which was still parked at the trailhead while the investigation was ongoing, and looked for the papers again. They were not there. She had told herself that meant nothing, that she might have misremembered where she had seen them, that there were any number of explanations. She had told herself this and had not believed it, and had said nothing and had started building the story she would carry for the next 3 decades. She had decided that he had left her. She had made that decision privately, quietly, at some point during the 8th or 9th week, when the investigators' questions had taken on a different quality, a quality of looking for reasons rather than for a person, and she had understood that the official story was moving in a direction she recognized. She had accepted it. She had not accepted it gracefully, not inside, but she had accepted it with the surface she showed the world, which was the surface of a woman who was going to be all right, who was practical, who had resources, who would land, and she had landed. And she had been, in most of the ways that counted to anyone watching, all right. She had never told anyone what she had believed. Not Clem, who was 12 when Gail disappeared, and who had her own grief to carry, and who Edith had tried very hard to protect from the particular bitterness that comes from believing you were left. Not the friends who had been with her through those first years. Not the therapist she had seen for 8 months in the early 90s, who had been kind and perceptive, and who had never quite gotten to the thing that was actually wrong, because Edith had not let her, and because the thing that was actually wrong felt like a shame she had no right to name, a shame that belonged to believing something of a dead man that turned out to be unjust, a shame she could not confess because she could not know in those years that it was unjust. The wolf came every night. And every night, just before first light, it did something that Edith did not notice the first week and could not stop thinking about after she noticed it. It turned, not back toward the forest, not in the random shifting way of an animal deciding to go somewhere. It turned to a specific bearing, northeast by north, toward the high ridge that formed the upper boundary of the Harmon County Forest Management Area, a long dark tooth of ridgeline that was visible from her bedroom window on clear days as a slightly different shade of blue at the edge of the sky. It sat facing that direction for a fixed interval, always long enough for her to be certain it was deliberate, and then it went into the trees. She began to mark the direction in her notebook. She used a compass, her father's old field compass that she kept in the kitchen drawer with the good scissors, and the spare batteries, and the things she kept because getting rid of them would mean admitting she no longer needed them. She took the compass to the window, and she lined the needle up with the wolf's turned face, and she wrote down the bearing. 22 nights running. The bearing was, within a degree or two of variation, always the same. She did not go to the forest. She was not ready. She recognized that about herself without judgment, the way she had learned to recognize most things about herself, with the particular clear-eyed inventory of a woman who has lived alone for long enough that self-knowledge is simply practical, simply a matter of knowing what tools you have available and which ones are not yet ready to be used. But she thought about the bearing every day. She thought about it while she was eating her breakfast, and while she was doing the small necessary tasks of a day lived alone on 12 acres, the splitting of kindling and the filling of bird feeders, and the management of a property that was bigger than one person strictly needed, but that she had kept for reasons she had not examined very carefully. She pulled out her old topographic maps, the ones she had not looked at since the first years after Gail disappeared, when she had traced the search grid with her finger night after night, trying to find the place where a man she had loved had become nothing. She spread the maps on the kitchen table, and she found her house, and she drew a line northeast by north from the house with a ruler and a pencil, and she followed that line with her eye up the slope of the lower ridge and through the forest management area and on to the upper ridge, the Harmon County side. The steep northeast face where the limestone shelves ran in horizontal lines like the stacked pages of something enormous that had been laid on its side. The line landed in the upper northeast quadrant of the management area, in a section of terrain so rugged it had not been commercially logged in 50 years and was accessed only by a single old forestry road that the county used for monitoring. She stared at that line for a long time. She had not been to that part of the forest in 31 years. She had not been to any part of the forest. She had chosen this house for its view of the ridge, for the illusion of being near something without being inside it, and she had maintained that choice with the consistency of someone who understands that some distances, once established, are not safe to collapse. She had told herself for 3 decades that the forest was just a forest, that the ridge was just geography, that whatever had happened up there had been resolved into the official inconclusive verdict, and that was the shape of it, and she had built her life around that shape, and it held. On the 15th night, she called Prentice Fall. She did not call him because she was afraid of the wolf, though she had reasons to be. She called him because she needed a witness, and because witnesses needed to be people who would not talk. And Prentice was 61 and had worked Harmon County for 22 years and was known in the county as a man who kept his mouth closed about things that were not his business. She had met him twice at the county fair and once at the hardware store, and had formed the impression of a man who was serious without being grim, competent without being theatrical, and comfortable with silence, in the way that people who spend most of their time outside are comfortable with silence, not as a performance, but as a preference. She called him at 7 in the morning and told him she had a wolf coming to her property. She described the tracks and the duration and the regularity, and she said she needed someone with authority to tell her what she was looking at. She did not say anything else. He came out on a Wednesday morning. He arrived in a green county truck and got out with the unhurried movement of a man who had been doing physical work all his life. And he shook her hand and thanked her for calling. And then he went to the tree line and crouched down and looked at the tracks. He was there for several minutes. She watched him from the porch, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, the morning cold and pale and absolutely still. He pulled a measuring tape from his vest pocket and measured the larger print and the stride length, writing numbers in a small notebook. Then he stood up and came back to the porch. He said, "Those are gray wolf tracks." He said it the way he might say, "Those are deer tracks," matter-of-factly, but with a quality of attention underneath it that told her he understood this was not ordinary. He told her gray wolves had been moving east from the Great Lakes populations for several years, that individual animals, usually young males, sometimes dispersed enormous distances, that it was unusual but documented, and that what she was seeing was consistent with a single large male that had ranged into the county and found her property part of its circuit. He asked how long it had been coming. She said 15 nights. He said nothing for a moment. She watched him absorb this number. Then he said, "Same spot every night?" She said, "Same spot." He said, "Same time?" She said, "Within an hour or so." He said HM. He looked at the tree line. He had the expression of a man who is working something through, turning it in his mind, looking at it from different angles, the way you look at an object you have not seen before and are trying to name. He asked if it had approached the house at any point. She said no. He asked if it had been vocal. She said once, a few nights ago. In the hour before first light, a sound she described as not howling, not a full howl, more like a low sustained sound, almost a tone, aimed at the ridge. He looked at the tree line again. She said, "There's something else." She told him about the bearing. She took him inside and showed him the notebook, the dates and times and the compass readings, the lines she had drawn on the topographic map. She showed it to him without comment, without editorial, in the way she had shown things to people her whole professional life, putting the information in front of them and allowing them to draw their conclusions. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at the map for a long time. He traced the line with his finger, the way she had traced it. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression that she could not fully read. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'd like to put a camera on that tree line tonight, if that's all right with you." She said it was. He came back that evening with a trail camera and mounted it to the oak at the yard's edge, and he came back the following morning to pull the footage. She made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and watched. She did not watch with him. She sat at the far end of the table with her coffee and her notebook and waited. When he was done, he turned the laptop toward her. The wolf arrived on the footage at 11:43. It was larger than she had been able to fully appreciate from behind the curtain, long-legged and wide through the shoulders, moving with the specific efficiency of something that has been crossing ground all its life and sees no reason to spend energy on anything except going somewhere. It sat. For 2 hours and 38 minutes, it sat at the edge of the yard, and the only movement was the subtle rhythm of its breathing and one occasion when it turned its head to follow a sound in the forest that the camera did not capture. And then, at 2:21, it did the thing she'd been marking in her notebook. Prentice let the footage run without speaking. On the screen, the wolf's head came up and its body shifted, a smooth reorientation without urgency, like a compass needle finding north, and it sat facing the ridge. In the camera's gray-green light, the wolf looked ancient and deliberate, like something that had been placed there, and it sat that way for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and then it got up and went into the trees. Prentice closed the laptop. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, this animal is tracking something. Not a scent trail, not prey behavior, more like," and here he stopped himself. He tried again. He said, "In my experience, when a wolf returns to a specific location repeatedly and orients to a fixed bearing the way this one is doing, it means there's something at that bearing that the wolf has registered as significant. A food source, a territory marker, a previous find. Something it knows about up there." She said, "What kind of something?" He said, "That's what I'd like to find out." He said, "I'd like to request authorization to sweep that northeast face. If there's something up on that ridge, I'd rather know what it is than not know." She said, "I'll come with you." He looked at her the way people looked at her when she said things they were not expecting, with a quality of recalibration, of updating their model of her. She said, "I know that ridge. I used to know it. I would like to come." He said, "All right. We'll go Thursday if the county approves it by then." She spent Wednesday doing the things she would have done on any ordinary day, doing them with the same surface attention she brought to ordinary days, while underneath the surface, something that had been fixed for 3 decades began very slowly, like ice in the first real thaw, to move. She took down Gail's photograph that evening, not to put it away, to look at it. She had not really looked at it in years. She had kept it in the periphery, the familiar shape of it on the wall, the way you keep things that are part of the room's architecture without quite being furniture. Now she took it down and held it in the kitchen light and looked at the face in it, with the specific attention she had been giving to the wolf for 15 nights. The attention of someone trying to understand something, to read something, to locate the truth in something that has been showing her only part of itself. He looked the way he had always looked in photographs, slightly surprised to be photographed, slightly amused by the formality of it. She had taken this one in October, the October before the last October, on a Sunday afternoon on the back porch, when the light was doing something particular with the trees, and she had gone inside for the camera, and he had still been sitting there when she came back out, just sitting there in the afternoon light with his coffee, and she had taken the photograph quickly before he could put on the expression he put on for photographs, and as a result, she had gotten the real one, the unguarded one, the face of a man who was sitting on his back porch on a Sunday afternoon and had nowhere else he needed to be. She put the photograph on the kitchen table and went to bed and did not sleep. The county authorized the sweep by Thursday morning. Prentice picked her up at 7 with 2 thermoses of coffee and a composure that she appreciated more than she could say, the composure of a man who had decided that his job that day was to be present and capable and not to make her explain herself. They drove the forestry road. She had not been on it since the investigation, 31 years ago, when she had driven out once to see where the truck had been parked and had immediately understood that she could not do that again, could not stand at that specific trailhead in the specific cold of that specific October without something breaking in her that she could not afford to have broken. Now she sat in the passenger seat of Prentice's truck and watched the road come at her and did not look away from it. The trailhead was different than she remembered. The signage had been replaced. The pull-off had been graded and graveled. There was a new fire restrictions notice on a post she did not remember. She understood that of course it was different. Of course 31 years of weather and maintenance and small county improvements had changed the look of it. And yet her body did not quite believe it. Her body expected the trailhead of that October, expected the cold of it and the feeling she had had there. And the difference was its own kind of strange, the way things are strange when they turn out to be ordinary. They started up the trail at 8. Prentice moved ahead, watching the ground, and she kept pace behind him, watching where she put her feet. The northeast face rose steeply through mixed forest, pine and hardwood, and the occasional stand of mountain laurel still holding its dark leaves. And the trail was narrow, and in places more suggestion than fact. She had not done this kind of walking in years. Her knees told her about it clearly and persistently, but she did not slow down, and Prentice, who was watching her from the corner of his eye with the unobtrusive attention of someone who has spent his career noticing things, did not suggest that she slow down. A mile in, the trail bent around a limestone shelf, and the character of the forest changed. The trees thinned, and the light became more diffuse, and the ground cover dropped away, leaving exposed rock and thin soil and the occasional hardy fern. The silence was of a different quality than the silence lower down, denser, with more space inside it, the silence of a place where sound did not need to compete. Edith stopped. She stopped because something was wrong with the air. Not a smell, exactly, though there was something in it, a particular damp and mineral quality that the open ridge did not have, a quality of enclosure, of a place that had held something. She had felt something like it once before, in a different context, in a different life. She knew what the feeling meant, and she stood very still and let it arrive the rest of the way, because hurrying it would not help, and because she understood that she had been traveling toward this moment for 31 years without knowing she was traveling. Prentice was already moving toward the base of the shelf, slowly, with the careful attention of a man who has found things in the woods before, and knows that the finding is not the end of anything, only a different kind of beginning. There was a section of ground just below the largest shelf, invisible from the trail, invisible from above, visible only from the specific angle they had approached it from. It was not dramatically different from the surrounding ground. It had been through enough decades of weather and root growth and the patient rearrangement of the forest to look, at a glance, like simply ground, but not at a second glance. At a second glance, you could see the shape of what had been there once, the outline of a camp, the ghost of a structure that had pressed against the earth in the way that only human habitation presses against the earth. There was a piece of fabric at the edge of it, blaze orange, the color hunters wore, and forestry consultants doing fieldwork in October. It was weathered almost to nothing, but orange is a color that resists the forest for a long time, and this piece had been wedged under a rock at the edge of the disturbed ground, protected enough from the worst of the weather, and it was still unmistakably orange. Prentice went still. He did not touch anything. He stood very carefully at the edge of what he was seeing, and he got his radio from his vest pocket, and he made the call in the same steady voice he had used for every other thing that day, the voice of a man who is managing something difficult by keeping himself very quiet inside it. She heard him say the location, the GPS coordinates he read from the device clipped to his vest, and then the words possible human remains, and she heard the coordinates, and she heard the voice of the dispatcher on the other end acknowledging, and then Prentice moved a few steps back, and the radio went on to his belt, and he turned and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been preparing a look for a few seconds and wants to make sure he has it right. He said, "Mrs. Calloway." She said, "I heard." He said, "I'm going to need you to stay here while I hold the site." She said, "All right." She did not sit down, though the slope was there and the limestone made a ledge she could have sat on. She stood at the edge of what she was seeing and let it be what it was, and she breathed, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was not the absence of thought, but the opposite, a kind of fullness that left no room for anything specific. She thought about the sky, which was visible through the thinned canopy above the shelf, blue and flat and cold. She thought about how high up they were, how the forest below them was a different world, and the road was further below that, and her house was below that. 12 acres, the pine walls, the bedroom window, the curtain. She thought about the curtain. She stood where she was and looked at the orange fabric and thought about October. Not this October. That October. The way October had felt from inside those 11 weeks. The way the cold had felt personal. The way the leaves coming down had felt like a statement about the world rather than a natural event. The way she had moved through that time with a quality of not quite being in it, of being slightly outside herself and watching herself go through the procedures of loss. She thought about the August conversation. She thought about it the way she had thought about it for 3 decades. And then, standing at the base of that limestone shelf on a Thursday morning in November, she thought about it a different way. She thought about what afraid of losing what we have sounds like when it comes from a man who had something and feared losing it and had gone into the forest the following month to do the work that would let him keep it. She thought about what it sounds like when a man says those words and then a month later goes into a forest and does not come home. And you never know why, and you build the story you can live with. She had built the wrong story. She had built it carefully and maintained it for 31 years, and it had served its purpose, which was not the purpose of truth, but the purpose of survival. And she did not blame herself for that the way she might once have, because she had had nothing to work with but absence and silence and the particular imagination of a woman who had been hurt enough times to know that the absence of people was sometimes the presence of their decision. The sheriff's department arrived 2 hours later. The forensics team arrived in the afternoon. Prentice stayed with her at the trailhead while the work went on above them on the ridge. He refilled her coffee from the thermos when it ran low. He answered the questions she asked, which were practical questions about procedure and timeline, and he did not ask her questions in return, which she was grateful for in a way she would not know how to express, but which she noted and kept. She thought, standing there, about the 11 weeks, about the shape of them. She had read recently, in one of the nature programs she watched in the evenings, that wolves maintain a territory by patrolling its boundaries, walking the perimeter, refreshing the markers, and that this behavior continues regardless of whether there is any immediate threat, regardless of whether there is any other wolf for miles. The patrolling is not responsive to danger. It is an expression of relationship, of attachment, of the specific claim that comes from caring about a place. She had not thought, reading that, about the wolf in her yard. She had simply found it interesting in the distant way she found many things interesting. She thought about it now. At one point she said he was a forestry consultant. He knew this ridge. She said it not to Prentice specifically, but to the air, to the record, to whatever was listening. Prentice said, "Yes, ma'am." She said he would have known how to set a camp in a bad situation. He would have known what to do. Prentice said, "From what I can see of the site, Mrs. Calloway, someone set that camp very deliberately, got themselves out of the wind, made good choices with what they had." She nodded. She drank her cold coffee and looked at the ridge. The search team moved up there for 3 hours. She could not see them from the trailhead, but she could sometimes hear the radio traffic, fragments, procedure, nothing that told her anything she did not already know in the way she had known things all day, in the way she had known things for 31 years, with a knowledge that was not quite thought, and not quite feeling, but something in between. The knowledge of a person who has been living alongside a truth that was never fully named. She thought about Clem. She would need to call Clem. Clem, who had been 12 years old that October and had been told her father was missing, had grown up with the weight of that word, missing, not dead, not gone missing, a word that holds a door open whether you want it open or not. She thought about what it would mean for Clem to hear this, the specific texture of that news, the way it would be both worse and better than the version they had lived with, worse in its finality and better in its truth, and she was not certain she was ready to navigate that yet, but she would be. She had always been, eventually, ready for the things she needed to be ready for. That was the thing Gale had written about at the end, and he had known her well enough to name it, and he had been right. The lead investigator came down the trail at 4 in the afternoon. He was a careful man, measured, with the particular gentleness that investigators develop when they have to deliver news that is not good news, but is also not the worst possible news. The news of a resolution that is not a happy one, but that closes something that has been open for a long time. He told her what they had found. The remains were consistent with long-term outdoor exposure. The frame pack had been largely protected by the shelf overhang. Inside a sealed canvas bag, a compass, a field journal, and a letter, handwritten, addressed to Edith Calloway. They let her read it in the front seat of Prentice's truck. He stood outside with his back to her. The light was going by then, the short November light pulling away from the ridge and taking its warmth with it, and she sat in the cold cab with the letter in her hands, and she read it. It was dated the 5th of October, 31 years ago. Gail's handwriting. She had not seen it in 31 years, but she would have known it in 31 more. The particular way he formed his letters, the forward lean of them, the lowercase g with its specific curve, the way he wrote her name, Edith, with a slightly longer pause at the D that had always seemed to her like an emphasis, like he was giving the name weight, like it mattered to him that the name was hers. She sat with the pages in her hands, and she did not cry. She had done her crying in installments across 3 decades, small private payments against what she had thought was one kind of grief. What she was doing now was something different, something more like reading. He had not planned to disappear. He had been working the timber survey alone on the northeast face on the 5th. He had heard a sound at the camp's edge in the dark, something in the trees, and he had gone out to check it, walking carefully, because the rock was always wet after sundown this time of year. He had slipped on a shale ledge. He had fallen badly, a significant fall onto uneven rock, and he had known within an hour that something was broken in a way that was not going to let him walk out. He had gotten himself back to the camp, to the relative shelter of the limestone shelf. He had assessed the situation with the clear-eyed thoroughness of a man who had spent his working life reading terrain. He had understood what it was. He had written to her over 2 days. The handwriting said as much, starting strong in the first pages, growing smaller and less controlled, and then in the final pages finding a different quality, not strength exactly, not physical strength, but something composed, something that had gone past the agitation of the middle pages and arrived at something quieter on the other side. He wrote about the August conversation. He wrote about what he had meant by it, which was not what she had heard, which was that he had been frightened, not of leaving, but of the opposite, of how much he stood to lose, of how much she meant to him, and how badly he had been managing that meeting in the previous months, how badly he had been managing the fear that comes with loving someone and understanding that love has costs, that it is vulnerable, that it can be taken. He wrote that he had been carrying a version of grief all that summer that he could not explain. Preemptive grief, the grief of someone who can see what they have and is so aware of its fragility that they begin to mourn it while it is still there. He said he had not handled that grief well. He said he was sorry for the stiffness of that summer, for the distance he had put between them without knowing how to close it, for the conversations he had not had, because having them would have required him to admit how afraid he was, and being afraid had not seemed, at the time, like something he was allowed to be. He wrote about the papers in the truck, which had been documents related to a private timber survey contract that had a third-party investor he had not told her about. Because the investor had been a man he did not entirely trust, and he had not wanted to worry her before he knew whether the concern was real. The concern had turned out to be real, and he had been managing it quietly, trying to resolve it before it became something she needed to know about. He had gone up on the northeast face to complete the survey and bring back the documentation that would let him address the problem, to do the thing that needed doing so that he could come home and finally tell her all of it. He wrote that he had been on his way home. He had been all year, in every version of the word, on his way home. And then he wrote, in the final pages, in the handwriting that was smaller than before, but still his, Still the forward lean of it, still the specific G, the thing he needed her to know above all the other things. He wrote that he did not know when she would read this, if she read it, that he did not know what the years between his writing and her reading had been like for her, what she had believed or had needed to believe. He wrote that he knew her well enough to know what she might have believed. He wrote that he was sorry that his silence had given her room to believe it. And he wrote, "Whatever story you built to get through it, Edith, whatever you had to believe to keep going, I understand it, and I don't hold it. You were always the person who knew how to survive. I was only ever a person who wanted to be near that." The letter ended there. One more line below that, in writing so small she had to hold it close to the fading light in the cab. "I was coming home." She read that line 3 times. She read it the first time with the part of her that was sitting in a truck at a trailhead at the end of a November day. She read it the second time with the part of her that had stood at that same trailhead 31 years ago in a different coat and a different life, and had looked at the place where the tracks stopped and tried to understand what it meant. She read it the third time with the part of her that had believed something for 31 years that had been wrong, and had been wrong in a way that she had never been able to call wrong because she had not had proof. Only silence, and silence will hold any story you pour into it. She folded the letter the way it had come. She held it in both hands and sat in the dark of the truck cab for a while without moving. What she felt was not simple enough to name. It was not relief, though relief was in it somewhere. Relief and something much older than relief. Something at the bottom of everything she had built on top of it for 31 years. It was not grief, though she was also in that cab, beginning to grieve in a way she had not been able to grieve before. The right grief, the one that had been there all along, waiting under the wrong one. It was more like the specific feeling of understanding a sentence you have read many times in the wrong way, and reading it finally correctly, and finding that the thing it means is not the thing you were bracing for. She thought about the wolf. She thought about the bearing, northeast by north, the same 22 nights running. She thought about Prentice saying this animal is tracking something it knows about up there. She thought about the wolf arriving 3 weeks ago, in the 3rd week of November, and about the State Wildlife Agency's first documented confirmation of gray wolves in Harmon County being from 6 weeks prior, which meant the wolf had been in the county at minimum since September, which meant it had been here since before it came to her yard, which meant it had been on that ridge before it came to her window. She thought about Gail's jacket in the frame peck, the one he always wore in October, the one she had given him the first winter they were together, dark green wool with a wide collar, the one that still smelled like him on the right kind of still night in a way she had never told anyone. She thought about what Prentice had told her once over coffee at his office in the months after. She had asked him in the spring. She had gone to his office on a day in April when the maples were coming in and the county road outside his window had that particular spring smell of wet soil and old leaf mulch that she associated with beginning things. And she had asked him the question she had been carrying all winter. She said, "Do you think it's possible the wolf found him up there and then came to me?" Prentice had his coffee in both hands. He looked at her across the desk, not with surprise, which told her he had been thinking about the same thing. He said, "I've thought about it a lot since November, Mrs. Calloway." He said, "What I can tell you from what I know about wolves is this. They navigate by scent across distances that have no human equivalent. Documented detection ranges under optimal atmospheric conditions can be measured in miles, not yards. A wolf ranging through unfamiliar territory is building a scent map of that territory, constantly the way we'd use a GPS, except the information density is far higher." He paused. He said, "If your husband's scent was still present on the ridge, a ranging wolf would have registered it, categorized it, added it to the map. And if that same scent signature appeared somewhere else in the wolf's range, the wolf would make a connection between those 2 points. She said, and then come to the second point. He said, and orient between them. Yes, that's consistent with the behavior on the footage. He said, I can't tell you the wolf understood what it was doing. I can't tell you it was trying to communicate anything. What I can tell you is that the behavior is consistent with an animal that had registered something significant at one location and was orienting toward a second location that carried the same scent. She said, what would have preserved the scent? After 31 years, he said, the canvas bag, the oilskin wrapping, the limestone shelf above it acting as a windbreak, reducing the rate of decay. He said, honestly, given the specific conditions, and given that we had an early and dry October this year that would have released trace scent into the air, I'm less surprised than I might have been. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, he was wearing the jacket when he fell. The one that was in the pack. Prentice said, yes. She said, it was a wool jacket. I had it for 2 years before I gave it to him. It was already old when he wore it. Prentice said nothing, but his expression said he understood what she meant. That old wool holds scent differently than new wool, that the jacket had years of him in its fibers before it went into that canvas bag on the northeast face, that the bag had been doing its job for 31 years. She said, I kept one of his blankets. Same material, same period. On the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, Prentice was quiet for a long time. Then he said, that would do it. She thought about what Prentice had told her once, over coffee at his office in the months after. He had said, wolves navigate by scent across distances that have no human equivalent. The detection range in the right atmospheric conditions is genuinely extraordinary. He had said, if there was something in your house that still carried that man's scent, the wolf would have known it from the ridge, and it would have known the scent was coming from your direction. She had the wool blanket on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the one that had been Gail's, that she had kept for warmth. She had always told herself, for warmth and not for any other reason, and that on still nights still smelled faintly, underneath decades of cedar and laundered wool, like the specific combination of wood smoke and pine, and something underneath that she had never been able to name, but had always known as him. She thought about a wolf on a ridge in October, finding something and then following a thread across 12 acres of forest and field to a window, and sitting down and waiting, and turning northeast by north every night before first light, pointing at the thing it had found, pointing at it until someone paid attention. She thought about what it means for something to find you worth finding. Clem drove up from Charlotte the following weekend. She was 43 now, Clem, which was the age Edith had been when she moved into the house. And the coincidence of that was not lost on Edith, though she kept it to herself. Clem had her father's way of moving in a house, that unhurried physical certainty, and seeing it now in the kitchen of this house was strange in a way Edith had not expected. Not painful exactly, but precise, like a note played at the frequency of something she had not heard in a very long time. Clem had spent the 3 days before her arrival sending careful, measured texts. The kind of texts people send when they are trying to be useful from a distance, asking about logistics and practical things. But Edith could read under the practicality the thing that Clem did not know how to say yet, the particular disorientation that comes from having the story of your life rearranged at 43. She had told Clem the essential facts on the phone, what the sheriff's team had found, the letter, the cause, the truth of it. She had read her one passage from the letter, the last one, the one that said I was coming home, and she had heard her daughter sit with that for a long time on the other end of the line, breathing, not speaking, and she had not tried to fill the silence because it was Clem's silence to fill when she was ready. Arrived on a Saturday with a bag of groceries and the specific energy of a woman trying to be efficient, because being efficient is easier than being undone. Edith let her be efficient. She let her make the soup and the cornbread, and let her reorganize the pantry in the way she always reorganized the pantry when she visited, the way that was slightly different from Edith's way, and that Edith always put back after she left. And she sat at the kitchen table and watched her daughter move through the house with her father's walk and her mother's hands, and she thought about how all of us carry the people we come from in our bodies, in the specific angles of movement, and how that is its own kind of permanence. They sat at the kitchen table with the topographic map and the notebook and the letter, which Clem read very carefully and very slowly, turning the pages with the same care she had used as a child with things that mattered. When she finished, she sat with it in her hands and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me what you thought?" Edith said, "Because I wasn't sure it was fair to tell you. Because I might have been wrong, and you needed to be able to grieve him without the weight of it." Clem said, "You are carrying it alone for 31 years. Edith said, "I was carrying the wrong thing. That's different." Clem put the letter down very gently, the way you put down something that belongs to someone else. She said, "I remember him talking about that ridge. I remember him saying it was one of the difficult ones. I was 10 or 11. He said the difficult ones were where all the best views were." Edith said, "That sounds right." Clem looked at the topographic map, at the pencil line her mother had drawn, northeast by north. She said, and the wolf just kept pointing at it. Edith said, every night, for 22 nights, Clem was quiet. She had her father's quality of silence, not absence, but thought, processing, the specific internal working through of a person who takes things seriously. Then she said, "I don't know what to do with that." Edith said, "I don't either. I've decided that's all right." She told Clem about the wool blanket then, about the cedar chest, the specific way it still smelled on still nights. She watched Clem understand what she was saying, understand it in the way that required her to recalibrate several things at once, and she waited while her daughter did that work. Clem said, "So you think it followed the scent, from the ridge to the house?" Edith said, "Prentice thinks that's how it would work. A ranging male with no established territory in this area finds something on the ridge, comes toward the house, finds the scent again at the yard's edge, keeps coming back." Clem said, "And then keeps pointing back at the ridge until someone goes." Edith said, "That's how it looked to me." They sat with that. Outside, the yard was empty. The tree line was bare and gray in the November light, ordinary, the ordinary gray and brown of late autumn, and there was nothing at its edge except the oak tree and the last of the year's dead leaves, and the place where the grass and the leaf litter met, and the tracks, which were still there, which would be there until the ground froze or the snow came. The wolf did not come back that night. It came back once in early December, which Prentice told her was consistent with a ranging animal checking a familiar point on its circuit, and then not again. She had expected, when it stopped coming, to feel the absence of it as a loss, as one more thing gone. What she felt instead was more like completion, like the last note of something, held long enough to resolve. In February, on a still afternoon with the light going flat and blue over the ridge, she took down Gail's photograph from the wall beside the bed, not to put it away. She had tried to put it away once years ago and had not been able to, and she was not trying now. She took it down to look at it, really look at it, with the attention she had been giving to the wolf, the attention of someone trying to read something true in something that has been showing her only part of itself. He was sitting on the back porch, the afternoon light in the trees behind him. The unguarded face, the one she had caught before he could put on the expression he put on for photographs. He was sitting there in that October light, and he had nowhere else he needed to be. He was coming home. She put the photograph back. Then she went to the cedar chest and took out the wool blanket and put it on the bed, on top of the quilt, where it fit and where it belonged. She kept In a small dish on the knitstand, a tuft of gray fur she had found caught in the bark of the oak one morning, snagged there the way fur snags on rough bark when something large has passed close to it. She had found it on the morning after the 15th night, the morning after she had called Prentice, and she had carried it inside without knowing why, the way you carry things when you understand that you might need them later and do not yet know for what. She thought she knew now. It was so she would remember that something had found her worth finding. Something that could not speak and had no words for what it knew had come to the edge of her yard and sat there night after night, pointing at the truth, waiting with the specific patience of something that had no concept of how long it might take. It had not given up. It had not decided she was not listening. It had simply come back the following night, and the one after that, and turned northeast by north before first light, and waited for her to be ready. She was ready now. The wolf was gone by then, gone into whatever territory it had been moving toward all along, across whatever ridgelines it had ahead of it, following whatever thread it followed across the world. She did not know where it was. She did not need to know. She knew where it had been, and she knew what it had done there. And in the still February afternoons, when the light came in at that particular low angle across the cedar chest, and the wool blanket and the small dish on the knitstand, she knew what she thought about that, and she kept it the way she kept the fur, quietly, as something that was hers.